Welcome, everybody. We'll get started here at the top of the hour. Okay, it does appear that it is the top of the hour. So welcome, everybody. My name is Alan Barr. I'm with COEH Northern California. And on behalf of the NIOSH-supported education research centers throughout the country, we're pleased to bring you another installment of the 2026 ERC Ergonomics webinar series, where we offer free monthly webinars on various topics on human factors and ergonomics. This collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. If you logged in via your registration email today, you will receive a link to an evaluation form that will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth one continuing education contact hour. On March 25th, we have our next webinar, and that is titled Surveying California's Working Age Population, Methods, Gaps, and Policy Implications. You can register for that and other webinars at coeh.berkeley.edu/webinars. For today's webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the Q&A as opposed to the chat, and we'll save some time at the end of the presentation to address questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available along with past webinars on the COEH Northern California YouTube channel. In support of our work, please take a moment to like and subscribe to that channel. A PDF of the presentation can be requested directly from coehce@berkeley.edu. That's coehce@berkeley.edu. And today we have the pleasure of having three speakers. The title of today's talk is From Science to Policy, Worker Safety, and the Proposed USDA Line Speed Rules. Our first speaker today is Dr. Bob Harrison. He's a clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco. He has diagnosed and treated thousands of work and environmental injuries and illnesses, and designed and implemented numerous medical monitoring programs for workplace exposures. He's also consulted widely with employers, healthcare professionals, and labor organizations on the prevention of work-related injuries and illnesses. Dr. Harrison has led many work and environmental investigations of disease outbreaks. He served as a technical and scientific consultant to the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration and to the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health. His research interests include collection and analyses of California and national data on the incidence of work-related injuries and illness. Dr. Harrison has authored or co-authored more than 80 peer-reviewed journal articles and more than 40 book chapters, contributed articles and letters to the editor. He is the co-editor of the most recent edition of the textbook in the field. And our next speaker will be Dr. Carisa Harris-Adamson. Carisa Harris-Adamson is a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She's the director of the Northern California COEH at the University of California, Berkeley, where she also directs the Human Factors and Ergonomics Laboratory. Her research focuses on the prevention of work-related musculoskeletal disorders through improved exposure assessment, biomechanical modeling, and the design of safer work systems. Dr. Harris-Adamson leads several large interdisciplinary projects examining repetitive and forceful work in high-intensity industries. She was a principal investigator of the poultry processing line speed study, also known as the PULSE study, a multi-site research effort examining the relationship between production speed, biomechanical exposures, and worker health in U.S. poultry plants. And finally, we have Kelsey Eberly. Kelsey is a senior staff attorney at FarmStand, where she engages in strategic litigation and movement-centered advocacy to fight corporate control and expose abuses in the industrial animal agricultural system. Kelsey also teaches at Vermont Law and Graduate School on legal issues pertaining to animal agriculture. She was previously a lecturer and litigator with the Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic at Yale Law School, a policy fellow at the Brooks McCormick Jr. Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard's Law School, and an attorney with the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Kelsey specializes in litigation to increase transparency and accountability in the industrial food system. She lives in Vermont with her family. That was a mouthful. So with that, I will hand it over to Bob. Dr. Harrison.
Thank you very much, Alan. Great to be with you all today. We're going to be talking about a study that was led by UCSF. Carisa and I are co-investigators with a very large team of researchers from UC San Francisco that focused on the poultry or the chicken slaughter industry and the hog slaughter. So these are the plants that process chickens and hogs, and that bring us all the chicken products that we purchase in the stores and the pork products that are so familiar to us all. And there's probably several 100,000 workers involved in this industry. And you're gonna hear about a very large study that we did in this industry for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And then where we are policy-wise right now in terms of proposed regulations that are going to impact worker safety and health. I'm going to give a few slides on background about how we got to where we are, and then turn it over to Carisa. So way back in 1906, there were food safety laws passed in the United States. So this is a story that goes back more than a century. Those food safety laws regulated the food supply in America and were focused at that time on the pork industry. And it created the predecessor for the U.S. Department of Agriculture that has inspectors throughout the United States to ensure the food safety. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, when it was established over 100 years ago, was strictly technically, according to that law, and Kelsey can comment later, pertaining primarily to food safety. And so what has evolved over the many decades are food safety inspectors in poultry and swine slaughter plants. And those inspectors would look at the animals as they came through for contamination. About 20 years ago, the USDA developed a self-inspection system so that companies would look at the safety, the microbial contamination of the animals as they came through to promote industry innovation and to provide the same level of food safety and consumer protection as actually having people from the USDA on these slaughter lines. And they developed something called the hemp system, which pertained to these poultry plants. And I think initially gave permission for about 20 poultry plants to implement a self-inspection system. And there were no worker safety requirements built in to that self-inspection system. They were permitted to go from 140 birds per minute on the slaughter line called the evisceration line to 175 birds per minute. That was followed in 2014 with something called the new poultry inspection system. And that authorized these limited set of 20 poultry plants to continue operating at 175, but continue to limit the other plants, the poultry slaughter plants in America, to 140 birds per minute. And you'll hear shortly what exactly we're talking about as the chickens are processed. And again, this was without any regulatory worker safety requirements. The National Chicken Council, which is a trade association for the poultry slaughter industry, petitioned the USDA to expand from those limited set that were running at 175 evisceration or slaughter speed to everybody. And at that point, we had about 140 operations in this what's called the new poultry inspection system, which was a self-regulatory system with the elimination of many of the USDA inspectors. And the USDA granted that petition, but again, without any worker safety requirements built in. The Public Citizen, a nonprofit advocacy organization, along with the United Food and Commercial Worker, sued the USDA for expanding the new poultry inspection system in 2020. And that went to court in Washington, D.C., that ruled that there was a violation by the USDA, including the failure to consider the impact of the evisceration line speed on worker safety. And ordered, essentially, the USDA to conduct a worker safety study in 2022. And here was the scope of the order by the USDA, which was to assess the relationship of the evisceration, the automatic slaughter speed, in young chicken and swine slaughter plants, and the scope, magnitude, and factors that influence worker safety and health. So downstream, after the evisceration, after this automatic slaughter, there's all these many workers who are processing the chickens and hogs by hand, cutting them up, and you'll see examples of all the other tests that they do. And in going from 140 to 175, what would be the impact on their musculoskeletal risk factors? In 2023, the USDA extended those line speed waivers now from about 20 plants to 49 establishments out of the total of about 140 in the United States. So those 49 are running at 175 evisceration birds per minute. And then we enter the picture. So that study that was required by the judge, the USDA contracted with UCSF, and you'll hear about that from Carisa shortly. And to our knowledge, it's the largest independent study of worker safety in poultry slaughter establishments. And then in February, just a couple of months ago, little more than a month ago, the USDA proposed rules for maximum evisceration line speed. And those rules, essentially in a nutshell, would permit plants who are operating under this new poultry inspection system, those approximately 140 plants, to run up to 175 birds per minute. And those rules don't have any significant worker safety requirements built in, and we'll hear about that later from Kelsey. The hog slaughter, okay, I just presented a brief synopsis of what was happening since 1997 to gradually increase the number of plants running at 175 birds per minute. The market hog, the slaughter of hogs, has a similar history, but not quite as complicated. This new model of self-inspection starts in 1997, the same year as the chicken slaughter. In parallel to the new poultry inspection system, the new swine inspection system was put in at 2019, and that permitted hog slaughter plants to run faster than 106 hogs per hour, which was the baseline speed throughout hog slaughter in America. The United Food and Commercial Workers sued in 2019, and the judge in Minneapolis ruled in 2021 that the USDA could permit 6 establishments to continue with what they called time-limited trial waivers. And those 6 establishments ran between 1,206 and 1,450 hogs per hour. And like poultry, ordered that there be a worker safety study, which we conducted, and you'll hear about shortly. And then in February, at the same time that the poultry processing speed proposed rules were announced, the USDA issued proposed rules for 18 of these new swine inspection system establishments that accounts for the vast majority of hog slaughter in America. And what the most significant thing, I think, for us to understand here in this webinar is that there were no worker safety requirements that were imposed on these plants as part of the proposed rule. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carisa to describe the work that we've done.
Thanks, Bob, for that background. So, as Bob mentioned, we performed really over the course of just under 2 years. We visited about 17 establishments to look at the impact of evisceration line speed on poultry and pork processing workers. I'm going to start with the results and a little bit about the methodology on the poultry processing workers, and then I'll move to the swine workers. I do want to thank our colleagues who were a huge, were critical to this project. The primary ones are listed on the slide, but we had about 78 faculty, students, and scientists and physicians that were responsible for collecting this data, and it was really a big lift, and I just want to thank them for their time. Okay, so as Bob alluded to, our primary goal was to quantify the association between evisceration line speed and or measures of ergonomic hazard. We added this measure called piece rate, which was a measure of essentially how fast workers at different jobs were working because it differed based on where they were in the line. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So piece rate is really a measure of how many pieces of product someone was handling per minute. And we realized very quickly into this project that that was going to be a really important measure of workload, something that was different than evisceration line speed. For poultry, we visited 11 plants that were operating between 140 and 175 birds per minute. So if you haven't been in a poultry processing plant, it starts by chickens coming in that are alive and they are hung upside down on shackles at a point where they then get euthanized or killed and eviscerated. That's an automated process, and that is the speed that we're talking about. It's how fast they're actually getting killed. After they get killed and they go through a very highly automated process to defeather them and um, eviscerate them, etc., they go into a cooler. And after the cooler, they come out on a belt essentially, and they have to get rehung by workers. And then those chickens that are rehung essentially get, oops, they get separated into bottom half and top half of the birds. The top half of the birds go to this cone line where they get, different pieces get separated from the carcass. And eventually, the pieces that we eat get packaged and then sent off. So there are workers in live hang, there are workers in chiller rehang, and there are workers all along this process for the bottom and the top half of the birds all the way to the packaging. For poultry processing, we again went to 11 establishments. We performed surveys on 1,047 workers. We performed a hazard assessment on 456 workers. For at each site, we were there for about 3 days for on-site data collection, and we had study teams of 7 people. And those 7 people did everything from collecting surveys information to doing medical interviews, collecting the ergonomic exposure measurements, as well as measuring parasitic acid. Um, I think what's notable is that our hazard assessment for ergonomic injuries or musculoskeletal injuries was really based on the ACGIH TLV for hand activity. This is a tool that has a lot of epidemiological data behind it. The big NIOSH studies, the Upper Limb Musculoskeletal Disorder Consortium studies, has provided a lot of evidence for a relationship between this score, which we now call the PFI-TLV score, and increased risk of disorders like carpal tunnel syndrome or hand wrist tendinosis. This is what it looks like. The TLV is a PFI-TLV score of 1. So any score above 1 would be hazardous. Any score less than 1 would be considered less hazardous. Of course, if it's less than this action limit, it's in the green zone. And if it's between the action limit and the TLV, it's in this yellow zone. We were strictly looking at scores above this line of 1.0 and scores below this. So we use that PFI-TLV score of 1 to indicate hazard. This is where there's a twofold increase in the risk of upper extremity disorders. I'm not going to go into the methodology of how we got here, but I will say that we used wearable devices and really detailed video analysis to quantify the hand activity level and the normalized peak force on these 450 or so workers. That there's other webinars that have been recorded and are in the COEH archives if you want more information on how we did that. But essentially, we were able to quantify this score for each of the workers that we evaluated. From the survey data, we found that 40% of workers experienced moderate to severe work-related pain over the last 12 months. And among those reporting pain, a quarter had difficulty maintaining their expected work pace, and a third considered quitting or changing their lines, and a third reported having difficulty performing activities outside of work, like caring for children, cooking, etc. 20% took paid or unpaid time off of work, and 40% did not report their pain to their supervisor or nurse. This was really important because we were hearing from the industry that there really weren't any problems with injuries in this industry because the reported rates were low. And so we felt it was really important to ask workers about their experience and what kind of pain they were experiencing and whether or not they were getting the medical care that they needed, given any reporting of that pain. As far as hazard goes, we identified that 81%, so 4 out of 5 workers, had a PFI-TLV score greater than 1, indicating high ergonomic hazard. This is a huge number. We don't typically see numbers this large in industries. You can see that the majority were just over 1 or between 1 and 2, with some even beyond 2 and 3, and very small percentage actually being less than 1. Again, a value of 1 means that they have a twofold increase in the risk of a musculoskeletal disorder like carpal tunnel syndrome. What I think was really important in understanding where we are with these proposed policy regulations is really summarized in this table here. And I think the unfortunate thing that we need to think about as scientists is that, to me, a lot of the proposed regulation is really based on this top finding here around evisceration line speed. And what really hasn't been discussed as well, or maybe considered as well, is the result on piece rate, which is really a better measure of how fast workers are working and what their workload actually includes. So here we see evisceration line speed, and we have workers who are at plants operating at an evisceration line speed less than 145 birds per minute. The second line includes workers who were at establishments operating between 145 and 175 birds per minute, and then workers operating at plants greater than 175 birds per minute. And you can see that there's really no difference in the mean PFI-TLV score. We have scores of 1.4, an average of 1.2, and another average of 1.4. And so they're very similar across those 3 groups. And that is what had led us to conclude that there really was no difference in risk of musculoskeletal disorders by evisceration line speed, because there are differences in how companies staff the lines before and after evisceration line speed that have a bigger impact on the actual workload of each individual person, and therefore the hazard that each individual person faces. And we did see that there was a difference by piece rate. And so remember, piece rate is how fast each person is working. So how many pieces of chicken were they handling? How many birds were they hanging per minute? How many tenders were they handling per minute? And so for each worker, it captured, their own, workload. When we looked at the workers in low, medium, and high piece rates relative to their job title, we can see that workers with low piece rates had an average PFI-TLV of 1.1. People with medium piece rates had a PFI-TLV score of 1.2, and workers in the high category had an average PFI-TLV score of 1.3. And so we see this increasing measure of hazard with increasing levels of piece rate, and those were statistically significant. And so clearly, regardless of whether their establishment was operating at a lower or higher evisceration line speed, there was this clear indication that the more chicken parts that someone handled per minute, the higher their ergonomic hazard was. Okay, so what we concluded in the poultry study was that MSD risk was not greater among workers at establishments at higher evisceration line speed compared to lower, but MSD risk was greater among workers who worked at a higher piece rate compared to those who worked at lower piece rates, with piece rate being a good job level measure of work pace. And regardless of evisceration line speed, 81% of workers were at increased risk of musculoskeletal disorders given that high hazard, and 40% of workers were experiencing moderate to severe upper extremity pain over the past 12 months. And both of those should be alarming and should indicate a need to change how things are done. I'm going to talk about swine processing next, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey to really explain how these results are being perceived and used in the proposed regulation. So again, in this study, we were looking at the association between evisceration line speed, piece rate, and measures of ergonomic hazard in the swine processing plants. And as Bob mentioned, these line speed waivers allowed these plants to operate between 1,106 hogs per hour and 1,450 hog per hour. So somewhat similar, but with very different jobs in swine processing. So hogs come in the front end, and there's a few different jobs in the front end that require the stunning and again the evisceration of the hogs. They do get hung on lines. And they get processed in different ways. There's a lot more jobs on the hot side. They eventually get to the cooler and then go to the cut floor and get packaged. These are sort of the main areas. There were a lot of different jobs that we looked at, so we ended up grouping workers by area. This was a little different in the sense that we actually visited 6 plants 2 separate times over 2 separate weeks. The first week they operated at their typical speed, so somewhere up to 1450. And then the second week they operated at 1106. So we were able to measure each worker twice, once when their plant was operating at a slower speed and once when their plant was operating at a higher line speed. We had study teams of 9 people, and we were there about 3 days to collect data for each of the 2 weeks. And we had about 472 workers that we had data on. The symptoms were, the reported symptoms was less than poultry. 20% of workers report experiencing moderate to severe work-related pain over the last 12 months. Roughly a quarter experienced difficulty maintaining their expected work pace. Fifth, roughly a quarter considered quitting or changing their lines. Roughly a third reported having difficulty performing activities outside of work. 16% took paid or unpaid time off work, and nearly a third did not report their pain to their supervisor or nurse. For this group, we had roughly almost half of the workers had a hazardous PFI-TLV score and were found to be at increased risk of MSDs. And we looked at the results slightly different. I'm not going to present all of the results. Again, there's a more in-depth presentation on swine processing study and the results of that in the COEH archives. But I do want to just indicate that we looked overall at sort of the odds of exceeding a PFI-TLV score of 1.0. So we looked across everybody and we didn't see a significant difference. We looked at those establishments who had a faster line speed of less than 1300 and a faster line speed of greater than 1300. And we really didn't see any differences there. We then looked at sort of the change in people moving from one category to the next. So think about them going from a non-TLT, so 1106, to a faster or a TLT week, meaning a faster line speed. And there were some workers who stayed in that sort of less than one score. There were some workers who went from a hazardous score, meaning a score greater than one, to a score less than one. Some workers who went from a score less to one to a score greater than one. And some workers who were, didn't matter if their establishment was working at 1106 or something faster, they were in this hazardous category. And so what we wanted to do was to look at how many people changed, right, from sort of this safer to a more hazardous category. That was about 14%. There were about 31% who stayed in that hazardous category from one speed to the other. 40% stayed below that TLV line and from one speed to another. And about 13% went from a higher risk category to a lower risk category. And so when you look at all of the workers across all the establishments, it looks like there's this sort of even swap of some people tend to have their job, speeds up and they have more hazard or more risk. And some workers get to slow down a little bit because staffing has changed. And so their relative risk actually, or sorry, the amount of hazard goes down. And when we looked at comparing the different establishments that had speeds less than 1300 to more than 1300 during their TLT line speed week, we really didn't see much of a difference. Uh, when we did see a difference was when we looked at each establishment on its own. And so these are the 6 different establishments, and this describes how the workers changed categories, so hazard categories, from one week to the next, meaning operating at a slower evisceration line speed to a faster one. And we see these substantial differences at establishment B and C. So establishment C, we can see that they have a very few number of workers that were hazardous to begin with and stayed hazardous, 14%. Nearly half of their workers had a PFI TLV score less than 1, and they stayed that way. Only 8.6% went from a below hazardous score to a hazardous score, and 19% went from a hazardous score to a less hazardous score when they sped up. And that's in stark contrast to establishment B, where most of their workers got worse, or at least a quarter of their workers got worse. They had 35% of their workers who were hazardous at both line speeds, and 27% who went from a safe score, meaning under a TLV score less than 1, to a TLV score greater than 1. And so this is where we start to see that how establishments manage their operations when they increase their line speed really matters. And the thing to remember is that piece rate is a measure of the line speed that's happening in front of the person at whatever job they're doing and how many people are doing that particular job. So if a line speed is operating at a certain speed and you add another worker, well, then their relative work or piece rate goes down. And so there seemed to be a difference in how these 2 establishments were handling that increase in speed, as well as how much, what increase in speed they actually had. I'm not sure why it's changing automatically. And so with these other establishments, A, D, E, and F, we can see that there's a little bit less clear consistency of people getting better or worse. When we looked at the conditional odds of having a PFI TLV score greater than 1 for every 100 hogs per hour increase in evisceration line speed, we see that establishment B, there's a 4-fold increase in the odds of being over 1. And this, in establishment C, we see that their odds went down. And I think that is an important part of the story that was really, in my opinion, not always captured in the articles that followed this study. And I think when you look at averages across establishments, you can really lose the sight of the fact that establishments handle this increase in line speed differently. And that has a dramatic impact on the hazard that the different workers are experiencing at those establishments. So just to finish, and then I'll hand it off to Kelsey. In this swine processing study, we found that higher TLT line speed was associated with mixed effects on MSD risk. At one establishment, there was a statistically significant increase in MSD risk. In other establishments, there were no statistically significant changes. And at one establishment, there was a statistically significant decrease in MSD risk. Regardless, about half of the workers had increased musculoskeletal disorder risk, meaning they had a PFI TLV score greater than 1. And at 42% of the workers experienced moderate to severe upper extremity pain during those prior 12 months. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it on to Kelsey to talk to us about taking science to policy and maybe what's gone wrong.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Carissa. So yeah, I'm going to go over, I'm going to retread a little bit of the ground that that Bob covered, but maybe add some nuance specific to my background in law. So just quickly, what I'm going to cover is sort of some factors about large-scale slaughter and processing, and that will give you a sense of the potential impact of these rules. I'm going to talk about the law and sort of why it is that these rules do not consider worker safety. I'll probably gloss over the history of the proposed rules since Bob covered it pretty well. And then I want to spend the most time talking about, how do the proposed rules talk about the research and the findings that Carissa just mentioned. And then where do we go from here? What are the next steps? Okay, so Bob described it pretty well, but just to give you a sense, both the chicken and the swine industry are highly consolidated, and a small number of very large companies operate a relatively small number of slaughterhouses. And these slaughterhouses are running 24/7. They are they're very fast operations where thousands of animals are brought in, killed, processed, and shipped out every day. Chickens, as Bob mentioned, are hung by their legs while they're still alive. This is typically done in the dark because to try to keep the birds, less panicky, I guess. So live hang is a particularly difficult job within these operations. And then as Bob was saying, the birds sort of proceed throughout the plant from there. Okay. And yes, they go into the where they're broken down. With pigs, like Bob mentioned, they're first stunned. This is electrical stunning or captive bolt stunning on the left. These are the pictures. They're then strung up, brought into the evisceration line, and then later broken down. Okay, so what laws pertain to this process? Like Bob mentioned, there are a few laws that were passed after Upton Sinclair's famous, investigation into the meat industry, and these are the laws that we have today. So it's the Federal Meat Inspection Act for livestock, so that would be cows and pigs, and for chickens and turkeys, the Poultry Products Inspection Act. I pasted some of the language from the sort of statement of purpose of these laws to give you a sense of, why are we talking about food safety? Their basic purpose is to protect the health and welfare of consumers by ensuring that meat and poultry products are wholesome, not adulterated, so not, diseased or with, toxic substances on them, and that they're properly marked, labeled, and packaged. So, what you see on the label of a chicken product is supposed to be accurate. You'll notice worker safety is not mentioned as one of the purposes here. So the FSIS, the Food Safety and Inspection Service, is the division of the USDA that administers this law, and its job is essentially to keep, harmful poultry products out of and meat products out of the stream of commerce, of interstate commerce, and to protect consumers from injury from those products. Okay. So there's another law that is applicable, and this is the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. This is a federal law that requires that all livestock, so cows, sheep, pigs, goats who are slaughtered, have to be rendered insensible to pain before they are slaughtered. Interestingly, this law talks about the fact that the use of humane methods prevents animal suffering, but it also results in safer and better working conditions for persons engaged in the slaughtering industry. So here we have a federal law that's applicable to all livestock slaughter operations that explicitly talks about promoting better working conditions by sort of making the process of sending animals more regular. And then one more federal law that we haven't talked about, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Folks on this call probably know a lot more about this law than I do, but in general, the act has this general duty clause, which requires employers to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards that cause or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. And then within the act, there are specified standards for specific industries. And there are guidelines for the meat and poultry processing industry, but there's no specific standard for those industries. And so what that means is, there are not meat and poultry specific rules that these operations have to follow to ensure a safe working place. And another sort of thing to keep in mind is just who is in the plants on a day-to-day basis. It is these food safety and inspection service inspectors, public health inspectors. They are the ones in the plants. It is not OSHA, officials being in the plants. So the USDA, through its food safety inspection service, is the one sort of regularly interacting with this agents or with this industry. Okay, one more law. This is another one that Bob mentioned that's very important at this stage, which is the Administrative Procedure Act. And this is a federal law that essentially requires that federal agencies do things reasonably and act within the law. So agencies have to provide notice to the public when they're going to change their regulations. They have to give the public a chance to comment on proposed regulations. They have to consider and respond to those comments when they are finalizing rules, their regulations. And when people, when the agencies finalize the regulations and people or organizations are harmed by those regulations, or whether through having a more hazardous workplace, or maybe they're losing money because of the regulations, the Administrative Procedure Act gives them the ability to challenge those regulations by filing a lawsuit in federal court. And courts looking at those lawsuits and thinking about whether the agency has complied with the Administrative Procedure Act, they're looking at whether the agency has acted in what's called an arbitrary and capricious manner. So, is the agency responding reasonably to the comments that it received about the proposed rule? Is it ignoring a large, problem with its proposed rulemaking? Is it, passing rules that violate the statute that it's supposed to be administering? So those are some of the considerations that, guide agencies in their rulemaking. I'll just breeze through this quickly. I think one thing that's kind of important to think about is in the meat and poultry industry's mind, the sort of deregulatory changes that Bob described, the line speed waivers, the pilot programs that began, in the late 90s, they're really, in the industry's mind, sort of the modernization of swine and poultry slaughter. So as, whereas before we had this system where federal inspectors were, inspecting every animal and sort of ensuring the safety of the meat and poultry products through that online inspection. now we have this more modern system where, it's done through, testing for pathogens, and essentially the workers on the line are supposed to be responsible for many of the types of jobs that the inspectors used to do themselves. So Bob covered some of this, so I'll just scooch ahead. I guess one more thing I do want to say before we talk about the rules is I think it bears emphasizing that these studies the studies that USDA commissioned that Carisa just described came because courts found that the agency had violated the law, that the USDA had violated the law in the course of its rulemaking in these prior cases. So it said, in effect, you did not sufficiently analyze worker safety when you adopted these rules. That's why these studies came about. And that's an important context for what's to come. Okay, so we have these proposed rules from the agency. They're proposing essentially to lift line speed limits in poultry and swine slaughterhouses. But of course, they have to talk about this study that they commissioned. And here's what they are saying. They claim that the studies found that work-related pain was not reported more frequently at establishments operating at higher line speeds. They claim that musculoskeletal disorder risk was more closely associated with piece rate than line speed. They say that in 5 of the 6 swine establishments studied, there was either decreased musculoskeletal disorder risk or no effect on musculoskeletal disorder risk because of increased line speeds. And they say establishments can maintain or even reduce piece rate by adding staff or redistributing tasks, even as line speeds increases. And finally, they conclude that line speeds don't meaningfully impact worker safety, so limiting line speeds is not effective in reducing worker injuries. And then they go on to say that essentially, these studies provide no basis for the agency not to move ahead with increasing or removing line speed limits. They, for the most part, don't talk about the high levels of MSD risk or worker pain in the poultry or swine industry. They don't really talk about the relationship between evisceration line speed and piece rate and sort of the staffing piece. And one of the most alarming things, I think, is they now claim that even though they commissioned these studies, they lack the authority not only to regulate worker safety, but even to consider it when making their rules. So they claim that a recent Supreme Court decision means they're not even allowed to consider worker safety, which is pretty interesting given that they had to that they did these studies, that they commissioned these studies after courts told them that they had failed to adequately analyze worker safety in their prior rulemaking. And the agency also claims that even if they did have that authority, the proposed rules shouldn't represent a marked change to establishment worker safety. That is the sort of bottom line conclusion that the agency gives. So what is next? So these rules are now active on the Federal Register. The agency is taking public comment right now. These are just proposed rules, so nothing has changed, from before until now. This is just a proposal to make a new rule. And right now, people are preparing public comments ahead of this April 20th deadline. And essentially, this is the opportunity to tell the agency, what is it missing? What did it get wrong? What is it not accounting for in these proposed rules? So one thing might be, is it mischaracterizing or failing to contextualize or ignoring sort of the most important parts of the pulse studies? Should it be moving forward with lifting evisceration line speed when there is such a, large problem with pain in slaughterhouse workers, when there is such a, high risk of MSD risk, particularly for poultry slaughter workers? And should it be, lifting line speeds without requiring, any minimum staffing levels to ensure that piece rates, stay at a safer level? Those are all things that people could submit comments to the agency about. So yes, as I was just describing, some of the things that people might raise in comments are that the agency is ignoring this problem, that it's mischaracterizing and improperly extrapolating from the studies, and that it is wrongly claiming that it lacks the authority to even consider worker safety. So this is a really important stage of the process because people are able to put information into what's called the administrative record. And when we put, studies and comments and the expertise of all these all these constituencies that are affected before the agency, that creates an obligation for the agency to consider what has been submitted. So if there are other studies that show that increasing line speed creates risk, if there are food safety risks to this, if there are animal welfare risks, this is the time when everyone is gathering those documents, putting them into the record for the agency to have to respond to when it finalizes these rules. So there's a comment period open until April 20th. After that, the agency will take everything it received, and at some point, possibly months later, it will finalize these rules by publishing them in the Federal Register. And that will essentially be its decision. The agency is deciding to move forward with the rule, and it can either sort of move forward with the rule as proposed or make changes in response to the comments. This can be a long process, but we get the feeling that the agency wants to move pretty quickly with these rules. So after the final rules are published, we'll have a chance to examine them, see how the agency has responded to the comments, see if the agency is responding reasonably and rationally, see if it's considering all of the information that was put before it. And then that will be the point also when organizations and individuals will be thinking about, is what the agency did vulnerable to a legal challenge? Is there, an argument that the agency is failing to consider some important aspect of this problem, that it's, ignoring some, significant issue? And so legal challenge would follow after the rules are finalized. And I think that's all I have. So happy to take questions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you all for your contributions to this topic. There are no questions in the Q&A box, so I'm hoping that's actually functioning today. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Carisa, here's one for you. Did you evaluate the number of workers, level of training, and other confounding factors on each line in your risk evaluation?
Yeah, we did consider them. So we did collect information on, for example, training. We didn't allow people who were in training and currently learning a job to be included in the study, and so each company sort of had their own ways of identifying that a worker was ready to be at sort of normal pace, work pace, and those were the ones that were included. The other confounders that we included were things like age and sex and some of the sort of standard confounders that we consider in these studies. It gets pretty messy to look at the specifics of the training and the specifics of the ergonomic programs. We did ask a lot of questions through interview about those things, and I can sort of loosely say that it was interesting that the company that we actually saw a reduction in hazard when they sped up in the swine processing company. That company actually did have a pretty good program. Um, there were things that obviously could be improved, and I think there were improvements that could be made, but by far and large, by a lot of different measurements, they had done more work in ergonomics to understand the hazards and address them. And so I think that possibly showed, and how when they sped up, they were able to handle that in a better way. Um, I think what was really shocking to me was um, just kind of given the amount of hazard and given the amount of pain and historical injuries and disabilities in this industry, it was surprising to me that the companies didn't have better injury prevention programs and ergonomic programs. It was also shocking to me that a lot of the response to injuries and complaints of pain were really focused around first aid. And I think there's a lot of improvements that can be made around how companies are responding to people's pain. Obviously, if there is not a great response to pain, then there's going to be more and more underreporting of pain. And I think we saw a lot of that in the numbers. So I'm not sure how to resolve the fact that we identified that there was so much hazard that increasing evisceration line speed didn't increase the hazard enough for them to put the brakes on letting these plants operate as fast as they want, essentially. And so that I'm having a hard time resolving. And so I don't know, Kelsey, if you can speak to that in any other examples, but from my standpoint, it's kind of like saying it's really hazardous driving at 80 miles per hour. So go ahead and drive at 100 because there's not that much of an increase in the risk of, getting in an accident. I don't know. I'm not sure how else to draw comparisons, but to me, it seems like really we should be talking about how do we make this industry safer at 140 or at 1106. And once we get it safer and reduce and mitigate the hazards at those levels, then yeah, let's talk about increasing production speed in a way that also keeps workers safe. And that just doesn't seem to be where this is headed at all. And that was I'm not sure how we can change the way the conversation is being had to steer it in that direction.
Yeah, I think that it's very discouraging. I do think, this agency is not a worker safety. They do not have this expertise, but the law, does require them to consider, you gave them so much information about how, some basic steps that these companies could take to make it safer. So the onus is on the agency to consider that, and before moving forward with these rules. I guess one thing I also wanted to just contextualize is, from my understanding, the slaughterhouses that are in this new swine slaughter inspection system or new poultry inspection system, those are the ones that were able to meet things like, minimum food safety, like they didn't have food safety violations, they didn't have OSHA violations, they didn't have humane slaughter violations. Now the agency is proposing to open this up to all the other slaughterhouses that perhaps couldn't meet those, basic requirements, and to slaughterhouses that have no experience with running at higher line speed. So it's also just, it's interesting that they're sort of extrapolating from your research to say, oh, there will be no safety issues with raising the speed from 140 to 175, for example. That's alarming.
Okay, we are coming up to our time limit here, but I do have one more question at least, and that is, were the findings shared with companies, and were any preventative recommendations suggested to companies or workers?
Yeah, it's a great question. And some of the other questions that I'm seeing in the webinar chat, I think are actually answered either in the report or in the archived talks, sort of how we calculated piece rate and et cetera. So encourage you to go look at those. But regarding the findings, we actually have been compiling reports and we have not sent them to the companies yet. I think we're focused right now on getting comments into the record. But we are going to share very specific numbers with companies on what we found at their plants. And we hope that they are open to making changes. We've told them that our doors are open and, we want to make things better for the workers. And we're happy to answer any questions that they have or give them some feedback. We did put together a couple of examples on how you can use sort of a risk-based approach to production and operations. Meaning if you start with a PFI TLV score of 1 or less, we showed how you can manipulate line speed in front of a certain worker, so job specific line speed and the number of staff to get to that target of 1.0 or less. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting mitigation approaches that could be done. And I personally would love to see these companies put together a consortium and work together to solve some of these problems, because there's also things like knife sharpening programs that wasn't within the scope of what we could look at, but probably have a big impact. And it would be great to see this industry pull together to answer some of these questions and really collectively make a difference in making this industry safer for its workers.
Thanks, Carissa. Bob, do you have any closing comments? We are, in fact, out of time, so we'll be wrapping up here in a moment.
No, Alan, just thank you.
Oh, very good. And Kelsey? Okay, great. So thank you, everybody. You can register for our upcoming events at coeh.berkeley.edu. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find recordings of previous webinars and other events. As a reminder, all participants who logged in with their registration email today will receive a link to an evaluation form, and that will qualify you for a certificate of completion with 1 continuing education contact hour. If you have any questions for us here at COEH Northern California, you can drop us a line at coehce@berkeley.edu. That's coehce@berkeley.edu. I want to give a huge thank you to our panel today. I wish we had more time because I know we finally got a lot of questions at the closing bell. But I think everyone here is really appreciative of your time. So thank you, panel.
Thanks, Alan.
And we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.